guys, this your next Q&A. And like I always say, if I didn't get you on this one, I'll try to get you on the next one. So let's get straight to it. Kiko420 wants to know, in several of your past spills, you mentioned that you were close to being a defendant in Operation Black Widow. How did you find out that you almost got caught up in that case? And since you functioned all over California at different times, where were you functioning at the time when you almost got caught up? When I was being looked at as a potential target for Operation Black Widow, I was functioning out in the Santa Rosa, San Francisco area. I was actually living in Ukiah. The above diagram is an actual piece of discovery that was used in Operation Black Widow's war room. As far as how I found out that I was a target or an unindicted co-conspirator, I ultimately found out in a couple of different ways. I believe I not only mentioned this in my book, but I also mentioned this in some of my past Q&As. But dating all the way back to 2004, right before they conducted all the raids, I had a disc that contained 1,956 pages of court-sealed documents that was in my hard drive when my house was raided. This disc was smuggled out of the federal courthouse, and then it was passed on to me so that I could go through it and disseminate it to some of the other RCs that were out at the time. The information on the disc centered around Operation Black Widow, i.e. the cooperators, FBI 302s, SSU debriefing reports, Pelican Bay SSU memorandums, Corcoran SSU memorandums, etc., etc. There was an extensive amount of information contained on this disc, and some of it pertained to me specifically and how some of the cooperators were trying to tie me in. One of the things that I learned from going through the disc is that one of the cooperators, Louis Big Roach Oroche, who was from my neighborhood, actually wore a body wire to my house during a meeting that was held between me, him, and Mexican Mike from Oakland. But I knew as far back as 1999 that the feds were watching me because they came up to the Mendocino County Jail and tried to talk to me. I mentioned this in my book as well. They were trying to talk to everybody that was involved back then. Right after they approached me, I got shipped off to San Quentin, and while I was there, I remember they had tried talking to Bismarck Nagoya Campo from San Francisco, as well as Hank Spanky Navarez, Jason Listo Bachmeyer, and Robert Wolfie Haas, all from Santa Rosa. They were making their rounds, hitting up everyone in hopes of finding more cooperators. So Maciel Rain wants to know, out of all the C's, who was the one you liked working with? Who was the smartest, the toughest, the craziest? Who had the most heart? Was there any city or state you'd rather have worked for other than the regiments you did work with? I've had the opportunity to meet and be around some solid C's throughout the years that I functioned. And although it was rare when I would have to work with C's like Lencho, who I didn't really care for, most of my experiences were positive. When you think about solid C's who have unquestionable heart and who are without question some of the most solid within the organization, there's always going to be your cornies, your skips, your pinkies, and your mad dogs. But one C who I really enjoyed working with and who I had gotten real close with was Jaime Smokey Rodriguez from Salinas. I worked with this brother when I was functioning in the Salinas Regiment, and we just hit it off from the gate. We didn't bump heads, we didn't politic against each other, and we were partners in crime. We did a lot of dirt together out there, and when it came time to handling business, we had each other's backs. That's what I liked about Smokey. When we were out there establishing the streets of Salinas, and we either had to jump out and mollywop someone to make an example, or we had to strategize in some sticky situations, we were able to do it without second guessing each other. One of the main reasons that I like working with Smokey is because we were so like-minded that a lot of times when we'd be out there on the streets doing shit, the right hand always knew what the left hand was doing. At some of the most critical times, we were able to communicate without so much as even speaking a word. And this is because we were always on the same page. So the Martin 9400 wants to know, how old is too old for someone to still be banging their hood, throwing up gang signs? Do you consider trolling modern day cell soldiering? That's a good question. Most definitely. Considering the dynamics of social media and some of the modern day changes that social media has changed when it comes to how people communicate, trolling today is the equivalent of cell soldiering. The only difference is that instead of these guys standing behind a solid steel door airing out their differences, they now do it behind a keyboard and a computer monitor. The internet, YouTube, and just social media in general has empowered a lot of these fake guys to create whatever kind of persona they want while they sit behind a keyboard and sell wolf tickets. It's a sign of the times. As everything else evolves and changes with the times, this is something else that has changed as well. I'm not going to mention any names or address anyone specific when it comes to some of the videos that I've seen posted on YouTube, but what I am going to mention is one of the unfortunate circumstances that has developed as a result of it. About a week ago, there was a video posted about a case involving a guy named Victor Skates out of Salinas. The video was part of a smear campaign that was directed at Joshua from the Homie Hangout. However, it's not Joshua that the video ended up having an adverse effect on. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Skates case, the defendant in the case, Victor Skates, is an active Norteño who is being charged with allegedly killing 9 Sureño Street gang members and multiple other attempted murders. Joshua was hired by the defense to go in and testify as a gang expert to help mitigate and mollify some of the inflammatory gang allegations that prosecutors typically use to substantiate their cases. So he's basically going to go in to help the defendant. And this is the extent of his involvement. However, the deceptive video that was put out showing that Joshua is set to go in and testify in that case was done in the context of making Joshua appear as if he was a snitch. And even worse, that Skates himself might be a snitch since his defense team is the one who hired him. I think this is crossing the line, and I think these troll videos are getting out of hand, and I'll tell you why. This isn't about defending Joshua in his honor. He can do that himself. But what people don't seem to understand is that this video can be very detrimental to Victor Skates in his defense. Coincidentally, his case is just starting to heat up, and he's currently in the process of trying to disqualify the federal government from giving him the death penalty. I've never spoke on OG or any of his videos, even when I've been the subject of his videos myself. But I just hope he shows some integrity and pulls that video out of abundance of concern for Victor Skates. Not Joshua. I'm sure Joshua would echo this himself. But again, for Skates and how it could adversely affect him. Some of those videos are funny and they're actually good for entertainment. But you've got to draw a line when it could hurt someone whose life is literally hanging in the balance. The other thing I can tell you guys is this. Victor Skates is not an NF member. He's not tied in like that. But all it takes is for someone with half of an agenda to start pushing a line against him, and the next thing you know, he's under a dark cloud of suspicion. From everything I know, he's a solid dude that answered the call. So it would be a shame for him to fall into questionable or bad standings based on something like this. Don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating for what he did or for any of the choices he made. That's his business. All I'm saying is that this YouTube stuff doesn't involve him, and it would just be a shame if it ended up hurting him. As far as how old is too old to be gangbanging, I think most of us begin to see the world through a different lens by the time we get into our late 20s or early 30s. That's when you're either going to grow up and take your life in another direction, or you're just going to continue on down that same stagnant path and never allow yourself to grow. If you're still gangbanging in your 40s, riding a lowrider bike like Baby Boy, then you're just a lost cause. The only way I think this is acceptable is if you're doing life and this is the life that you have to live. So AG wants to know, can you talk more about your drug, heroin use while running a regiment? Did you use heavily at any other points in your life as an NF member? What was it like going through withdrawals in the observation cell and going cold turkey? I've struggled with my addiction to heroin since the first time I tried it at the age of 12. This continued on all the way up until I was arrested in 2004. Even during the period of time when I was a full-fledged NF member in leadership positions, I still continued to struggle with it. I'm sure most of you know that the NF forbids any habit-forming hardcore drugs such as heroin, cocaine, meth, etc., etc. It's a policy that's been in existence for years, and contrary to what people might think, it'll get you a death sentence if it becomes a reoccurring problem and if you don't heed warnings to stop. Especially when it comes to someone in a leadership position, you're held to a higher standard and you're not given the same type of latitude that others might get. This is why so many C's try to hide it and go through great lengths to mask it. They become what I call, or what I refer to as, closet junkies. Trust me, there's a lot more C's getting loaded than you might think. They're just hiding it and are careful to keep it under tight wraps. There's a lot of parallels and similarities between the NF and the MA. I'm sure anyone that knows a little bit about these two organizations knows this much. The only real significant differences are the leadership structure and the unwritten rules on the drug policies. The MA doesn't have a typical leader at the top of the apex like most criminal organizations. Instead, they function as a collective body where everyone's basically on the same wavelength and they make decisions collectively. The NF, on the other hand, is structured under a paramilitary structure where you have captains, lieutenants, generals, commanders, etc., etc. There's a pecking order and everyone knows where they fit in and what their role is. Like I said, aside from that, one of the only real differences is the unwritten rules on the drug policies. The MA has no standing policies. It allows its members to indulge with no threat of reprisal, and this is something that's always been tolerated. But again, the NF strongly forbids the usage of any habit-forming hardcore drugs because of the detrimental effects and the far-reaching consequences that can come from it. In short, here's why. The NF's position on this is that it would be a grave injustice to allow its members to indulge in any type of hardcore drugs based on the fact that its members are often forced to place each other's lives in each other's hands, and that its members are also forced to place each other's freedoms in each other's hands. Would you want someone whose sense of awareness is only running at 60% and that he's only seeing a fraction of what he'd normally be seeing if he wasn't all smacked back on dope? I doubt anyone would want to put their freedom or life in someone's hands who's in that type of condition. The other part of it that is as equally concerning is that someone on dope also brings that whole dope fiend mentality with them, and they can't be trusted. It creates situations where you can't be sure if they're lying, they start stealing, scamming, skimming money, etc., etc. So that's why the NF is so strict when it comes to its drug policy. The one thing I can honestly say about myself is that I hit it well and that I didn't allow it to dictate how I ran the regiment. The other thing I'll say is this: I didn't get out and just start using as soon as I was back out on the streets. Something usually triggered it. I tried to stay clean, and for the most part I did. But then something would end up happening that acted as a trigger. For example, I stayed clean when I discharged in April of 2003, and I didn't relapse until around March of 2004. The trigger that caused me to relapse was seeing all the different signs that told me that I was about to get caught up. I seen the walls begin to close in on me, and I knew law enforcement was about to take me down. When I found the GPS tracking device on my car, when I was on the run for the shootout I had in Campbell, and when I started seeing all the other telltale signs, that's when I said fuck it and relapsed. As far as the last part of your question regarding how it was going cold turkey in the observation cell, I'll just say this. At the time I had to kick that shit, I didn't have a monkey on my back. I had a pack of fucking silverbacks on my back, and it was so bad I wanted to die. Kicking that shit was a deterrent enough to never want to go through that again. And even though I felt like I was close to death, I still continued to even hide the fact that I was kicking, because I still couldn't let people know I was coming down off that shit. I didn't ask for nothing to help me either, because I didn't even want the COs to know that I was kicking dope. Because I knew if they found out, that they'd tell everyone, and that I'd catch heat for it the same way I would have if anyone else would have found out about it. So Juan Carlos wants to know, do you think the NF will ever be able to rebrand as a legitimate legal organization similar to what Hell's Angels do, where they are a criminal organization but front like they're something else? No, no, and no. The NF is a criminal organization by definition, and it will always remain a criminal organization. The Hells Angels and the dynamics of how they operate is a little different. Keep in mind that the NF evolved behind the walls of prison. The founders were criminals. They had criminal visions, and in my opinion, because of the things that the NF is involved in, they'll never rebrand as a legitimate organization. Although the Hells Angels is an organization that was involved in a mix of criminal and legitimate activity, they've always functioned under the concept of being a club. It's a little different. The NF does strive to establish legitimate businesses, and it recognizes the purpose for having a mix of legitimate businesses, like the Hells Angels. But the majority of the time it's had these legitimate businesses, it's only been for the sole purpose of either using them as fronts or to watch the books, money laundering. I guess anything's possible, but the NF's philosophy has always been to identify itself as a criminal organization that's involved in organized crime rackets. And even though the Hells Angels front themselves as a legitimate bike club, they'll always be involved in criminal activities as well. The only part of your question I think would apply is what you said at the end about a criminal organization that fronts to be something else. The NF has always been about false portrayal, meaning that although it's always been deeply involved in criminal activity, it's always trying to pose itself as a legitimate organization, but only for the purpose of avoiding law enforcement scrutiny. So Nicholas Aviles Jr. wants to know, how come the NF never tried to get involved in legit big money businesses that could have netted them millions of dollars per year, like the construction or garment industry, garbage hauling and waste management, etc., like the Italian Mafia did in New York City? I think it all comes down to the lack of vision from those who are at the top of NF leadership. Look at the MA. By all accounts, they're a bigger organization that has had its hands in a lot of different money-making ventures. But for whatever reason, they haven't been able to make that last leg of the race either. I think the closest both of these organizations have gotten is right now in the 21st century, where they both started working together with some of the cartels. The MA had some of the bigger opportunities with their close association with the Tijuana cartel that was ran by Benjamin Arellano Felix. MA leader Ronaldo Ayala, who's currently on death row, Jose Bat Marquez, and David Popeye Barron were the MA's catalysts that opened up a lot of doors and established a lot of their resources.
A 3-year investigation targets members of a Mexican mafia prison gang, and tonight 20 people are facing charges. I'm Carlo Cicchetto.
And I'm Barbara Lee Edwards. The power of this operation reached far beyond prison walls, and it continues into San Diego communities. The accusations include conspiracy to commit torture, extortion, and possession of drugs for sale. CBS News 8's Marcella Lee is live downtown with details of Operation Amaro. Marcella?
Barbara Lee and Carlo, the accusations read more like a script from a mafia movie, but investigators say these crimes were real and violent. 10 of the 20 people accused appeared in court today. They were arrested last week from around the San Diego community. Prosecutors say they were working for the Mexican mafia prison gang, acting on behalf of incarcerated members to collect and extort money, using intimidation and gruesome measures if necessary.
This time he'll enter a not guilty plea.
35-year-old Brandon Stevens is one of 20 people accused in a range of violent activities allegedly ordered by the Mexican mafia prison gang. He and 3 other male defendants were arraigned in court along with 6 women.
They have been advised of their constitutional rights,
who were brought out to face the judge 3 at a time. All defendants denying the allegations.
I know I didn't do nothing.
Which include drug trafficking and conspiracy to commit torture.
There are other charges that involve violence, such as assaults likely to produce great bodily injury and kidnap for the purposes of extortion.
The arrest came after a 3-year investigation by a joint task force looking into the deadly and violent Mexican mafia prison gang. Prosecutors say the gang, also known as La M, was operating inside and outside of prisons. Prosecutors say one of the men directing the group was death row inmate Ronaldo Ayala, seen here in 1988 when he was found guilty for the execution-style murders of 3 men in a southeast San Diego auto body shop. They say Ayala and inmate Bat Marquez ordered murders, assaults, and extortion using phones and emails inside of prison to conduct their illegal activity.
So if someone was out selling drugs, he would extract a tax and have that tax or that money that extorted money be collected by various individuals. And so that's the allegation.
That was Gretchen Van Holmes, a defense attorney whose client couldn't be in court today because he is in the hospital having just received a liver and a kidney transplant. Prosecutors say many of the other 10 defendants are currently incarcerated. They will also be arraigned. The Joint Task Force includes many agencies, including the FBI, the San Diego Sheriff's Department, and the Department of Corrections.
But yet, with one foot in, the MS still wasn't ever able to round that final corner and take it to another level. The NF has had similar opportunities on a smaller scale. Carlitos Terrazas broke ground with the cartels. BJ, Paki, and Bubba also secured cartel resources when they were out there in Mexico. And even I myself worked with Don Julio in San Jose, who was a member of the Gulf Cartel. But the NF has never been able to take it to that next level either. It seems that leadership from both of these organizations have just been content with reaching a certain level, and then any further aspirations gradually fizzle out. The push to elevate and prosper further fails to ever materialize. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone ever suggesting the garment industry, waste management, or any of those other huge industries. It's always been on a small scale, such as independent landscaping businesses, tattoo shops, clothing stores, and cell phone retailers. The will was there, but again, not on a corporate level, only on a sole proprietor level. The comparisons you made with regard to the Italian mafia are some big feats to accomplish too. Different time, different era. Law enforcement technology wasn't as sophisticated as it is now when the Italian mafia did it. I'd be willing to bet that they wouldn't have been as successful as they were back then if they were up against the same type of technology that exists today. Let's be honest about how the game's played these days too. Back in the 70s, 80s, and even into some of the 90s, you were able to operate with some longevity, and you were able to run a criminal operation for a length of time because people held their mud and they weren't as fast to tell on you. Everybody knows now that nobody lasts that long out there anymore because people will tell on you. If it's not because they're trying to get out of jail free or save themselves from getting stretched out from a long ass prison stint, it's because somebody's envious of what you got and nobody likes to see the next man advance unless they're winning too. Both the MA and the NF also took lightweight stabs at the rap industry by promoting and investing in Latino rap as well. GUN was probably the NF's biggest success as far as the rap industry, but this also bought the NF leadership and Darkroom Familia federal indictment too. So I think that pretty much sums it up right there. Lack of leadership vision, there's no drive when it comes to bigger advancements. It's virtually impossible to maintain any longevity because people will tell on you, and law enforcement technology has reached epic proportions. This makes it almost impossible to overcome these types of obstacles. So SFC wants to know, what's the point of being pulled as a sleeper? Is this still an honor? I think one would want their status as an NF member known for the respect factor and perks that come with being made. Can you elaborate? Agreed. There is no honor or any true honor in being pulled as a sleeper. As you pointed out, when someone becomes an NF member, it's considered to be an honor. It's almost like reaching a pinnacle in your criminal or gang career. You usually go from a street gang norteño to an NR member, and then you're elevated to an NF member. It's no longer about keeping your status under wraps or trying to mask your affiliation to avoid getting validated. Those days are over. It used to be about keeping a low profile and flying under the radar. But all that has changed. In fact, back in the days, those who didn't get NF tattoos or other tattoos that identified their affiliations were considered to be the intelligent ones. Because once you were validated, you didn't serve the NF any good if you were slammed down in the shoe like everyone else. But nowadays, it's all about who can get the biggest eye buster and who's crazier by getting them on the forehead, on the face, or all over the head. In fact, in federal prison, it's mandatory for all NF members to get the NF insignia tattooed on them. This is a tribute to your allegiance. In fact, in federal prison, it's also a customary practice by all the different gangs or cliques to represent their affiliations with tattoos of their gang's insignia or symbol. Now that gang members are no longer getting validated in California state prisons, it seems like this is becoming more common in state prisons as well. The only real purpose for pulling a sleeper is if he's going to be used to perform some type of special assignment. This isn't common anymore. Sleepers were more popular in the 80s when NR or NF members were sent on undercover covert missions to hit an unsuspecting target. I haven't heard of sleepers being used for a long time, and when they were used, it was only on a very limited basis. I guess with some of the changes that CDCR has recently enacted, such as the creation of these 50-50 yards and some of these other pilot programs that they're trying out, sleepers could be utilized in those situations. But even then, there would have to be some type of serious underlying purpose to do it, such as trying to hit a high-profile target, or like I said, some other type of secret covert operation. I could see the federal branch using sleepers to send it to the state to whack those who they consider to be renegades or bandidos. Hopefully this sheds some light on what you were asking insofar as how sleepers are used. So JR wants to know, who is Sandman? Where did he come from? And what is he to you? Where did he come from? I don't know. Why? Are you trying to put a green light on him or something? I'm bullshitting, man. Sandman's my IT guy, and he's also a friend. If you've been following the channel for any length of time, you'd already have figured this out by now. He's the one who edits the videos, edits all the voiceovers. He takes care of uploading and downloading all the content, and he also helps design and create both of the channels. Sandman does a lot. Without him, the show couldn't go on. So Chilling with Howie wants to know, why doesn't anyone talk about the old timers that are never getting out and what kind of rules and politics they go through? What age do they get removed from mainline, if they do? I believe I have talked a lot about the old timers. I've done multiple profiles on a lot of them, and I actually know more about the older guys than I do most of the newer ones. I'm not sure what you meant about what age they get removed from the main lines. It sounds like you seem to be under the impression that once they get to a certain age, that they just get discarded and tossed out like a piece of trash. NF members remain active within the fold until they take their last breath. You're never allowed to walk away or to go on to do as you see fit once you hit a certain age. The only way they're ever removed is if they fall into bad standings. Otherwise, they are always obligated to function within the organization. Semi-retirement is something that was created in the 70s, and although these subdivisions were scrapped years ago, I've only heard about the act of retirement from renegades like Nuevo and Chuco. They talked about retiring Cs that were basically in their way, or Cs who in some way were hindering their foul agendas. When a C reaches the age of his 60s or early 70s, he's given the option of functioning in a modified capacity. He's still obligated to function, and he still has the ability to act in the role of an advisor. But once he can no longer do some of the physical things that some of the younger C's are able to do, then he will be allowed to function in this modified capacity. That's all it is. So Morgan Hill wants to know, can you tell us more about your experiences with the Bulldogs in the early 90s when they started to break away? When I hit Susanville in 1989, the Bulldogs were still programming on the yard with us. They kicked it with the rest of us just like any other norteños from any other city or town in Northern California. However, the division was just starting to develop, and Fresno had just started taking steps to actively isolate itself. This was happening all over California in different prisons, not just Susanville. Each prison had its own individual set of political circumstances that contributed to its own issues, but this was already a statewide issue. When it came to Fresno, I actually had a real good rapport with a lot of them dudes, and I was the only NR member that they talked to whenever there was an issue. And I didn't care about the tension that this division was creating either. I continued kicking it with a lot of these dudes because they were some solid homies. In fact, back in 1989 through 1991, we still had weight piles on the yard. When I hit the 3-yard, Lassen, I got a job as a recreation clerk. I sat behind a fenced-in enclosure all day passing out dime plates, the weight belts, the softball equipment, the horseshoes, the basketballs, and other recreation equipment. Since I had to sit behind that enclosure all day, the recreation coach gave me a whole set of weights, a bench, an incline bench, a preacher bench, and everything else I needed back there. I basically had my own weight pile. Sometime in 1991, a couple things transpired on the yard that forced the issue and caused Fresno to pull all the way back. We got into a conflict with the Southsiders, and the homeboys from Fresno decided that they weren't going to get involved. This created bad blood, and this is when all the problems on the yard started escalating. Being that I had a good rapport with a lot of the homies from Fresno, I tried talking to them to see if I could get them back in line with us, but they were adamant about their position. Their whole thing was they were concerned about us all landing in the hole together and then things going all bad between all of us. Unfortunately, it ended up happening anyway, because after the yard erupted, the Sureños didn't recognize any divisions amongst us. They looked at all Norteños as Norteños, no matter where you were from. By late 1992, the division was in full effect, and this is when homeboys from Fresno began openly referring to themselves as Bulldogs. They also began to call for their own independence, and at this point, they were openly denouncing anyone who chose to function under the direction or leadership of the NF. This came from the propaganda that Crackers, Flacco, and other highly influential former NF members from Fresno were spreading. Within a good 3-year span, the split was in full effect and the war was on with Fresno. Because of the adverse and negative position that they were now openly taking against the NF, they were no longer allowed to coexist, and it was decided that they would all be removed from the main lines. Recently, they've even tried to implement modified programs in an effort to phase Bulldogs back out to some of the mainline yards, but this has been unsuccessful as the conflict is still in full motion.
The program aimed at integrating gang members is now on hold after it's caused more problems than solutions.
The effort in California lockups started about a year ago, but it's led to inmate fights at facilities, including in the Central Valley. Action News reporter Natalie Granda has more on the Fresno gang that officials say is at the center of the trouble and what's next in the prison plan.
The goal is to get inmates in prison, like gang members, to get along. But state officials put that effort on hold after it's caused more fights and riots. The effort started a year ago by allowing inmates from different gangs into the exercise yards together. However, state prison officials say since last fall, inmates have been in what they call, quote, modified programs after causing altercations. Prison officials say some of the issues occurred at Pleasant Valley State Prison in Coalinga and most recently the Correctional Training Facility in Soledad.
Modified programs are intended to be temporary. They're put in place when you have an altercation or some kind of incident so that the staff can do whatever they need to in terms of investigations.
According to the State Inspector General's office, a gang out of Fresno is one of the biggest culprits, causing more than 30 fights within the last year. Lieutenant Steve Card with Fresno Police's Magic Task Force says Fresno's gang members are known to stand alone.
When individuals that are bulldogs get sentenced to state prison and they move into a prison situation, an environment, they have a reputation of not getting along well with other gangs.
Prisoner rights attorney Charles Carbone says his client is an inmate at Pleasant Valley who was injured during the most recent riot. He says these integrated yards have proved to be a failed program and they don't keep the inmates secure.
They just didn't keep them safe at the most basic of levels. So what you're seeing now is the department having to face that reality, having to seriously rethink these policies, and probably having to clean up some wreckage that they needlessly created.
CDCR officials say they're continuing to find a solution and ways to safely house inmates, but would not disclose any of their options. Natalie Granda, ABC 30, Action News.
It's unfortunate that all this has happened because Fresno was a big part of the Norteño collective, and there's no doubt that they made the collective a lot stronger. But this was all dictated by bad politics. So Slick Rob wants to know, can you talk about Roach and Little Roach from the neighborhood? Are you related to Lucky from San Jose? Rumors are you two were brothers. No, me and Lucky are not brothers. We're not related at all. If you're talking about Ronald Shelton, there's no relation. I already mentioned Louis Big Roach Orochi in one of my earlier questions. As I said, I grew up with him and his younger brother Eddie Little Roach Orochi. In 1994, I was in Pelican Bay C5 with both of them. I coincidentally landed in the same pod while they were celled up. When it came time for Little Roach to parole, he was transferred to the Santa Clara County Jail to face a double murder on two other homeboys from my hood, Federico Arvello and Barry San Jose. Federico was pictured at right in a white wife beater, fourth from the left. When Little Roach transferred out, I celled up with Big Roach until I paroled in 1995. Little Roach would end up getting convicted to LWOP, life without the possibility of parole, along with William Dreamer Fernandez, another homeboy from my neighborhood. The next time I would see Big Roach was in 1999, after he paroled, when he came out to have a meeting with me and Mike Eminem Perez from Oakland. Later I would find out that Big Roach was working with the FBI in Operation Black Widow and that he had wore a body wire to my house during the meeting with me and Eminem. So, Z Josephanapadi, with however you pronounce that shit, wants to know, can you elaborate on what you meant on your video, Crescent City being a racist place? How would you know what the people were like if you were locked up and weren't part of the community? This is an easy question to answer. I'm not a racist, man, but let me explain this. You asked a fair question when you asked, how would I know what the people were like in Crescent City's community if I was locked up and wasn't a part of the community? First of all, you're right. I wasn't directly involved in the community up there. I only lived in Crescent City during all the 90s while I was incarcerated in Pelican Bay. I think it's pretty safe to assume that when you're housed in a prison for that long that's located in a community like the one we're talking about, this is enough time for you to hear plenty of stories from other inmates' families who were subjected to preferential treatment when they came out there to visit some of them. I spent 10 years in that shoe, so I heard plenty of stories from some of my neighbors up there, and it was pretty obvious that they treated certain people different when they would come out there to visit their loved ones. Whether it was because of their skin color or because of the fact that they had relatives or loved ones at the prison is up for debate. Some people won't like you simply based on the fact that you're visiting an inmate. I can't call it, but I know what I heard, and it was repeated enough times to where I felt confident that it was something that wasn't being exaggerated. So that's my truth right there, man. So, the brother 408 wants to know, do you hold resentment towards Chuco for his actions towards you? Do you feel Chuco is truly for our people or personal gain? Well, I think he's turned into personal gain. I think the position that was given to him, not earned, I think he went to his head and it went all bad from there. Resentment? No. Do I feel a level of disappointment and like he should have done more or could have done more? Of course I do. Considering the circumstances and how everything played out, I definitely think he should have used a lot more discretion and foresight, especially in light of the fact that Lencho was the one providing information, and even more so because this involved my standings. Chuco knew what was involved. He had all the information and he was aware of all the facts. You don't ever jump the gun and go off of something that's open to that much interpretation. Bottom line, he didn't follow the rule of thumb. You always give the same kind of discretion and the same kind of benefit of the doubt that you would expect yourself. I know for a fact that he didn't do that. I'm not crying about it, and what's done is done, but I guarantee you that if it would have been handled the way it was supposed to be, things would have been different. So Unknown wants to know, can you elaborate more on Oso Winston? Elaborate about what? I really don't know what you want me to elaborate on. Elaborate on my interactions with him? The only information I can provide on him is basically what I've already put out there. I met Gerald Oso Winston from Santa Rosa and San Quentin sometime in the early 1990s. I was on the 6 yard with him when the 6 yard was behind East Block with the other death row yards. When I first met him, he was just an NR member, but in 1994 he was recruited into the NF by Mikey Castillo and Art Big Smiley Ramirez, both from Salinas. Years later, when I would run into him again in Quentin, we made plans to network out on the streets, as he also had resources in Daly City, and I was plugged into the San Francisco Regiment at that time. Robert Wolfie Haas from Santa Rosa was another NR member who was also supposed to link up with us at that time. I made several attempts at getting together with Oso, and we even spoke on the phone one time, but I could never get him to meet up with me because he was always in traffic. One thing I could say about Oso is that when it came to hitting licks and getting involved in some of the street business, he was someone who was about his business. Don't quote me on this, but I believe he ended up falling in the bad standings for making statements in the Operation Black Widow investigation. The last time I went through San Quentin and I was housed in Carson section, also was housed on the first tier, which at that time was Special Program and PC. That's all I really got on him. So Zone wants to know, would you consider Watsonville a state or Fed-ran regiment? That just depends on who's out there and who's in charge of the regiment. I know that Watsonville was under federal influence when BJ was out there, and it's been like that for a while now. I can't speak on what's currently happening out there right now, but from what I've been able to gather, it's being ran by an RC who's playing both sides. They're trying to show some level of loyalty to both state and federal leadership by sending money and maintaining an open line of communication to both of them. Believe it or not, a lot of RCs are doing the same thing. They're playing both sides because they don't want to get crossed up in the power struggle. But unfortunately, they can only play this game for so long. Eventually, they're going to have to make a choice, because you can't operate a regiment and be involved in this type of criminal activity without some level of exposure getting back out. So Star 474 wants to know, did you ever have personal dealings with Sean Bubbles Cameron from Hanford? I heard he got indicted. Do you know how much time he got? No, I never had personal direct dealings with Sean Bubbles Cameron from Hanford, but for a brief period of time, I networked with him, Sylvester, Silver Gomez, and Anthony Chino Morales through Pocky from Salinas. From what I've been able to gather, Bubbles was just recently indicted with his wife Vanessa and 34 other members and associates that were all functioning within the Hanford Regiment.
Right, they're a violent organization. They intimidate people, including their own members.
Federal prosecutors make a major dent in one of California's most dangerous gangs. That is our top story tonight, live at 5. Good evening. I'm Liz Harrison.
And I'm Warren Armstrong. The U.S. Attorney today announced sentences for dangerous Nuestra Familia prison gang members. Action News reporter Linda Muma is live at the federal courthouse in downtown Fresno with more about their punishment and how officers were able to take them down. Linda?
Warren and Liz, federal prosecutors tell me the final 5 defendants were sentenced here in Fresno on Monday on various drug trafficking charges. In total, 38 defendants were prosecuted here in Fresno and sentenced to federal prison, including 18 of them to more than 10 years.
A huge breakthrough in the war against one of California's most dangerous gangs.
They're ruthless. I mean, they truly are ruthless. They're very regimental, and they've been very active since the early 70s.
On Wednesday, federal prosecutors announced the sentences of 38 defendants in cases targeting members of the Nuestra Familia prison gang, an Hispanic criminal organization known to exert control over street-level Norteño gang members. Affiliates, they say, are involved in drug trafficking and violent crime throughout the Central Valley.
They communicate in so many different ways, whether it be cell phones that are snuck into prisons, notes. They do a lot of coding, either on the phone, or they do a lot of coding by what we call keystering notes.
According to court documents, the Nuestra Familia trafficked in methamphetamine, distributing the drugs and collecting debts in Fresno, Kings, Tulare, Madera, Merced, Kern, and Stanislaus counties. It also obtained large shipments of drugs from Mexico and distributed them to members of its network for sale throughout the state.
Much of the violence in towns up and down the Central Valley can be traced to the criminal activities of the Nuestra Familia and its affiliates.
Among those sentenced in Fresno is one of the highest-ranking defendants in the case, 38-year-old Sean Cameron of Hanford. He'll now spend the next 32 years in a federal prison.
By sending them to federal prisons in far-flung states throughout the country, these prosecutions are going to make it more difficult for the leaders of the Nuestra Familia to communicate with each other and to direct the activities of their associates on the streets.
And officials tell me that a number of federal, state, and local law enforcement officers helped investigate and prosecute these cases. More Nuestra Familia members were also sentenced up in Sacramento, bringing the total number now behind bars to 69. Reporting live in downtown Fresno, Linda Muma, ABC 30 Action News.
Unfortunately for him, he allegedly made a critical mistake by having his wife use her cell phone to help facilitate a drug shipment of methamphetamine that was coming through some of his contacts in Mexico. She then also used that same cell phone to set up payment for another transaction that also involved methamphetamine. During the period of time between December 2009 to June of 2010, the FBI claimed that Bubbles and co-conspirators obtained 45 pounds of methamphetamine. These drugs were supposed to be delivered to other NF regiments that spawned across Northern California, Utah, and other Midwestern states where NF strongholds were established. So Machete wants to know, are there vatos who are not full-fledged NF members, regular Northern inmates who are strictly torpedoes for the NF? What is the reasoning for continuously reading the Constitution day after day, even after knowing it and practicing it year after year? This is what the NR was created for, to push the NF's agenda. These are the torpedoes. These are the soldados. They're the first ones to engage with any opposition that attempts to oppress the Norteño following. A lot of NR members are content with just remaining an NR member for the rest of their careers. They have no interest in elevating their status or becoming a C. They're content with being a soldier, and that's all they want to be. The purpose for continuing to read the Constitution over and over is not only to memorize it, but also so that it becomes second nature. It becomes you. It becomes embedded in your thought process, in your mind. Like I said before, we used to refer to the Constitution as the Bible because we studied it in a religious type of fashion. Whenever you read something like this over and over, it becomes you. It becomes part of who you are. And like I said, this oath becomes embedded in your psyche. So JD wants to know, if the peace treaty ever took place on the streets and not just in the Pinta, would the NF and the feds deem those hoods no good too because they are following what the state orders? No, not unless some of these hoods went above and beyond what was asked of them and somehow dishonored their identity as Norteños. Just like all these Norteños that are in the state prisons and who have taken part in this agreement to end hostilities. They're not going to get deemed for following directives that were passed down to them from acting leadership, whether they're considered renegades or not. They're just following suit, and everybody knows this. The ones who are going to be deemed and held accountable are the ones who pass these directives down and the ones who use their influence to mislead them. It will be the same on the streets. Those who are in leadership positions are the ones who are going to be held to answer. The collective will be welcomed back into the fold, and they'll all be clear. I'm sure the powers that be would have been elated if all these Norteños would have rose up and took a stand in opposition against these renegades who hijacked the state leadership positions. But in all fairness, I'm sure they knew that this wasn't practical either. The disbandment of the NR back in 1997-1998 is another example. Rogue NR members attempted to hijack the entire movement, and they attempted to lead them astray. But when everything was said and done, those NR members that acted as the lead catalysts were removed and everyone else was brought back into the fold. So JT wants to know, the end of hostilities in Cali has caused a lot of trouble for the NF. It has also caused a huge amount of trouble for Cali AB and the feds. I heard Cali AB are on the outs in the feds and can't hold keys or call shots. What have you heard about this, if anything? The only thing I've heard on this in regard to the California branch of the Aryan Brotherhood is that they're drawing heat in the federal prison system because of their counterparts in the state tentatively agreeing to this agreement to end hostilities. And that's probably because of their dealings with the blacks or the Africanos. Them agreeing to be on the yards with the BGF and some of the other black affiliated groups out there. I don't know how true it is, but that's what I heard. But I also heard another rumor that the state branch of the Aryan Brotherhood are at odds with the federal AB faction because they're not actively pursuing the NF and some of their allies in the federal system. In other words, the state ABs are upset because they're not going after these other groups that are trying to start a war in the state system. No matter what you believe and how you look at it, it's a mess, and whether it kicks off in the state or federal system, it's going to kick off somewhere, and both of these systems are powder kegs ready to explode. So Stephen G wants to know, do you think there's a chance that someone from the federal faction gave the feds info they needed to get the state leadership indicted so they could end this and get them in reach? I know it's far-fetched, but you can never tell. No, that would be perceived as crossing the line and resorting to the type of dirty tactics that a degenerate would resort to. Or what the NF would call working hand in hand with the canines. Anytime you fraternize with the enemy, resort to these types of degenerate tactics, or work with the canines to accomplish this type of set goal like this, is crossing the line. Whether you tell directly, indirectly, inadvertently, or use someone else to facilitate this type of information to get someone crossed up is telling. Straight up. No matter how you slice it and dice it, it's a form of snitching. In short, I don't think that something like this would even be remotely possible. So Johnny Wheeler wants to know, please talk about the New Mexico car. I'm not sure what you're referring to about the New Mexico car, so I'll just cover some of the areas that I believe you're referencing. Over the course of these last couple of years, the presence of NF street regiments have become more prevalent across the country. Utah, Colorado, Kansas City, Arizona, Washington, and New Mexico are just some of the states where the presence of NF street regiments have been discovered. This is definitely attributed to the widespread recruitment blitz that's being engineered by NF members in the federal prison system. But there's also a lot of Norteño street gang members in some of these areas, and this is a factor as well. New Mexico is one of these areas, more specifically Albuquerque. There's several Norteño street gangs in Duke City, Barrio Cruz Alta, Los Ranchos, Los Terrones, Martinez Town, and 14th Street are just a few. Speaking from personal experience myself, it's harder to build and establish a regiment when you don't have the ability to do it in the traditional sense of having Norteño street gang members to recruit from. In other words, when you break ground in a foreign area where there's not a lot of Norteño street gangs and you have to use other races, i.e. Native American Indians, Caucasians, Asians, or Paisas, Mexican nationals, it's harder because these individuals aren't laced up on Norteño politics and just the way in which the NF operates on the streets. So you find yourself in the position of utilizing these individuals to sell your dope and to accomplish your endeavors. But at the same time, you have to do it with finesse by masking what it is they're really involved in and not really exposing the fact that they're involved in organized crime or activity that could possibly get them indicted on a federal RICO case. I experienced this on a small scale when I built and established a regiment in Mendocino County, Ukiah, where there really wasn't that many Norteño gangs in that county. In their place, I was forced to substitute them out with Native American Indians from some of the Indian reservations and other individuals who were considered foreign to that lifestyle. My point is, it's been a lot easier and a lot more fluid when you have a pool of Norteño street gang members to work with, like some of these places I mentioned above: Washington, Utah, Colorado, Kansas City, and New Mexico. That's why the NF's federal branch has had so much success out there in some of these other states. Another New Mexico gang that the NF has also established an alliance with is SNM, Syndicato de Nuevo Mexico. This prison gang is only about 250 to 300 members deep, but they have a lot of influence and is known for its extreme acts of violence. Recently, it's said to have embarked on a massive house cleaning campaign targeting informants, law enforcement officers, district attorneys, and even judges who the gang feels has made it personal by continuing to prosecute and lock up the gang.
Prison gang is now in the crosshairs of the FBI.
Federal agents say a 5-year investigation shows Syndicato de Nuevo Mexico members are reorganizing and going after informants and federal agents and prosecutors. News 13's Brittany Bade has that story.
Dean and Jess, the FBI raided 6 different homes in Albuquerque last night, and we have learned that search spread to 6 other cities throughout the day, targeting homes in Santa Fe, Las Vegas, Espanola, and Wagon Mound. Federal agents are searching for any evidence to help lock up key members of the violent prison gang, SNM.
A gang that started after the deadly 1980 Santa Fe prison riot is only growing in numbers and boldness. A just unsealed federal search warrant lays out how federal agents say leaders of the Syndicato de Nuevo Mexico prison gang are giving their 250 active members new rules to target informants, witnesses, federal agents, and prosecutors. This nearly 5-year investigation came to a head in July following the murder of Leroy Lucero, aka Smurf, a former S&M member who became a government witness. Agents believe S&M orchestrated the hit and killed him in his Las Vegas driveway. Following the hit, agents determined there were other active murder threats and went searching for evidence. One of the first places they did today was at the Albuquerque home of Greg Montoya, or Jinx. Agents say he and Shotgun Raul Guzman, also of Albuquerque, are the guys now telling members to, quote, smash any government rat on sight. In Las Vegas, they also searched the home of Luis Sanchez, who allegedly shot at the home of a former member and said, if you call the cops, we'll come back and kill you. The nearly 200-page warrant outlines dozens of other examples of members selling drugs and making threats. Like in 2016, when agents got a hold of the gang's green light list, ordering hits on several NMCD employees, jail staff members, and cooperating defendants. Today's search was part of an ongoing investigation and effort to chip away at New Mexico's largest prison gang.
So far, this operation has resulted in 127 arrests and has solved 9 cold case murders in the state. The FBI says the operation is still ongoing. Dean.
All right, Brittany, thank you. A great number of the people arrested today have been charged. At this point, it is unclear what other charges they may face or what evidence was collected.
Hopefully this is what you meant when you refer to the New Mexico car. If not, resubmit your question with some clarity and I'll elaborate on it. I hope you guys have enjoyed this Q&A. Like I've said before, as long as you guys continue to submit your questions, we'll continue to do these Q&As. So get your questions in. Also, we have more profiles that we're already working on, so they should be dropping soon. And for those of you who keep asking where to put your questions at, type them in any comment section and we'll find it. In closing, we just want to keep thanking all you guys for your continued support and just for continuing to stick with us.